All right guys, Chris here with RackUp+Go, and today I'm going to be teaching you how to install a secondary alternator, and we're going to do that by installing this Techni bracket kit to give you a mounting point for your secondary alternator. So without further ado, let's get into it. All right guys, so behind me is a 2023 Mercedes-Benz Sprinter 170 Extended with the OM654 2-liter diesel engine. And that's what this Techni bracket kit is going to fit and allow us to install this ARCO alternator. So in this kit, it's gonna come with everything that you need, including the drive belt. So we've got various idler pulleys, the main piece, which is going to be this pulley that's going to go on the crankshaft pulley using this bracket here. We have our hardware for it. This is the bracket that's going to go on the side of the oil pan. This is what's going to actually hold the alternator once it's all assembled. We've got our necessary hardware for attaching that. Again, I mentioned the belt. It does come with the belt. This is a Gates 6-groove belt. This is going to be available at most parts stores. And one reason I like this over the factory N62 option is that this isn't a very expensive or hard to find belt where you can only get it from the dealership. This is going to be widely available. We have our tensioner, another idle pulley, and then probably one of the most important pieces is our crankshaft locking tool. And so this tool, you'll only need to buy it once if you're doing multiple of these installs. This tool is going to hold the crankshaft in place while we break free the bolts that hold the crankshaft pulley to the engine. So it comes with a couple spacers here, and in the instructions it shows you how to assemble this for both attaching the crank pulley and disassembling the one that's on there. And then we've got our ARCO alternator here, and this will be put on towards the end. So with any good install, it starts with an uninstall. And first step in the directions, of course, is going to be uninstalling something on the engine. And unfortunately, it's this coolant tube. So we are gonna have to drain the coolant from the engine. We're gonna be removing this coolant tube, and that's gonna give us a lot of access for our wrenches to get in and disassemble the bolts holding the crankshaft pulley on the motor. So we'll get started with that, and then right after that we'll be moving on to step 2, removing the existing drive belt and removing the bolts for the main crank pulley so that we can add this bracket and this flywheel to the main crank pulley so that we can drive that auxiliary belt that's going to power our alternator. So let's jump in. All right guys, we've got the hood popped. We're over here at the engine bay, and right now we're going to be showing you the coolant tube that we're going to be removing and the steps in order to do that. We've got a 5-gallon pail underneath that's going to catch all the coolant. We're not going to be reusing that because we can't guarantee its cleanliness. We're going to fill with new coolant. So we're going to pop the pin on the hose on the one side, and then there's another pin on the opposite end of the plastic tube that goes into the engine that we'll also have to pull. All right guys, so the tube that we're going to be removing is this tube right here. We have to pull that pin up right here. You can see it's kind of a grayish silver color. And then there's going to be another pin on the opposite side, probably hard to see, but that's going to be holding the tube into where it goes into the boot in the engine. So this gets pulled up, and then we should be able to remove this rubber tube, and then same thing on the opposite side. We're going to be draining from this low point right here to start. We'll wait for the coolant to kind of fully exit, and then we'll work on that other pin, pulling that and removing this coolant tube. All right guys, so this is the tube that we just pulled off, and the way this pin works, so this is kind of upside down because we've got this flipped up right now, but this, you can see how it's kind of cutting across the circular diameter here, and this is what's holding this tube on. And the way I remove this is you pull this silver clip up, and it indexes into the side here like this. I mean, if you pull it all the way off, it's not a big deal. Obviously this comes off, you can just put it back on like so, but this pulls up, indexes into there, and now you can see we've got an fully open area, so it's not locked in anymore. And then you just kind of wiggle this back and forth, and it pops off the coolant tube down below. So just a quick tutorial, and we're going to be doing the same for the opposite end. It's really difficult to get the camera down in there for you to see, but this is relatively simple on how this gets removed. So just pulling that out, we're going to do that on the other side, and then we should be able to remove that plastic coolant pipe that's right in front of the engine. That's going to give us access so that we can get on that crank pulley. The next step in taking this coolant tube off, there is an E12 Torx bolt holding this pipe in place. So we just need to take this off. It's a little hard to find with a socket, but it doesn't take much to loosen it up, and then you can just kind of turn the extension by hand here. Got that loosened up. Spinning it by hand. Okay, that's fully loose. You can see the coolant pipe is now able to kind of wiggle a little bit. So I'm going to come down there, make sure that pin's pulled. All right, so our pin's pulled. We've got that bolt loosened up. We're just going to kind of wiggle this out back and forth. There we go. And now you can get a good look at the bolt that I was loosening up. It is captured, so you don't have to worry about dropping it into that coolant bucket. But now we got all this room in here that we can work with. So the next part we're going to be doing is we're going to be removing this drive belt from the engine here, or from the pulley. We're going to do that by untensioning it, pulling it off, and we're going to make sure we note the routing. Fortunately, we got this camera here so we can play this back. So we're coming off, coming around what looks like maybe the AC pulley over there, straight up to that next pulley. We go around to the far side, which I believe is the main alternator, straight across the top, around to this side, back around that tensioner over there, and then back to here. So helpful for you, also helpful for me, so we can go back and look at this video and know exactly how that's routed. All right, guys, so we got our coolant pipe removed. It's out of the way. The next step is going to be to relieve the tension on the drive belt. We've noted that routing when we were down below. We're going to relieve the tension from the tensioner up here. That's going to use a T60 Torx bit right here. You're going to want your ratchet set to loosen, and we're going to be fitting that into, there's a keyway in there. We're going to cam the tensioner counterclockwise. We'll remove the belt from it, and that's going to relieve the tension on the main crankshaft pulley, because we're actually going to be removing the bolts that hold that on. And what we don't want is to have a bunch of tension from a belt on that crankshaft pulley, potentially causing it to come off and lose its orientation. It is kind of keyed on there, but we still want to try and make sure that crankshaft pulley stays on right where it is, because we're just going to be adding on a flange and a pulley on top of that. So we want that to stay right in place. So we'll remove the drive belt so that does stay right in place. And what we'll do is we'll just kind of take it off that tensioner and then just kind of leave it right there. We don't necessarily have to reinvent the wheel, pulling this whole thing off and then redoing all the routing. Unless the drive belt's kind of old and you want to check it, you could do that. But we're just going to loosen this up, pull the belt off, kind of leave it hanging there, and then we'll start our work on the crankshaft pulley. All right, guys, so the next step is going to be to remove this black plastic bearing cover, I believe they call it in the instructions. And it's real simple, no tools needed, just a couple of fingers, grab on the inside flange, and pops right off. So, all right, guys, so now that we got the belt loosened up off of the crank pulley, it's very important that we don't turn this over in a counterclockwise direction. So it says turn crank pulley in a clockwise direction. It's okay to move that. That's the general direction that it's moving. And in order to ensure that we're not going to turn it over backwards while we're loosening these bolts up, we're going to use this crankshaft locking tool. And so that's just going to be this part here. And what we're going to do is assemble these two. They're threaded on this side, hollow on this side. So this bolt's going to come through here. We're going to assemble this on here. We'll snug that up in a minute. Grab the other one, Now, what these are gonna do is those are actually gonna slip over these bolts. Two of them right side by side, and we're able to stick a breaker bar or ratchet in here and hold that crank pulley in place while we break the other two free. So we're gonna break two free, we're gonna rotate the unit around, break the other one free, rotate it around, break the other one free. That way we can hold this crank pulley in place. Once they're all loose, we can just back them out with a regular ratchet and probably hold this in place by hand and not really need this. This is gonna come back in handy. You'll notice we've got two holes here. Over here in this step, we're going to be attaching it using these two screws to this flange once we bolted it on in this step. So this is actually going to line up here. We'll bolt it right on there. We'll be able to hold it in place while we tighten these four screws. And these have a very specific tightening sequence, so we're gonna be torquing it down to 37 foot-pounds or 50 Newton meters, and then 45 degrees, 45 degrees, 45 degrees, 45 degrees. So, and doing it in like a crisscross pattern, just as you would if you were tightening lug nuts. So that's gonna ensure this thing gets sucked in and drawn in very balanced. So we'll tighten these up, we'll move over and we'll start loosening up these bolts on the crankshaft. All right guys, so the external star you see here, external torques, that's going to be an E12, and we're going to be taking our socket and sticking it right on there, loosening those up. The crankshaft locking tool is going to be going on the other two, slipping over the top of those socket heads while we break these free. So I'm going to reposition down below where I can get on this with both my ratchet and a breaker bar with the crankshaft locking tool on those two, and slowly work my way around, breaking each one free. All right, so the setup we got right here, we actually threaded a bolt into, this is where one of the idler pulleys is gonna go, and we're actually using that to brace our crankshaft locking tool so that I can have two hands on the ratchet. One to brace it because we've got to use an extension. The crankshaft locking tool doesn't leave us with a lot of room in there. So I'm holding this side of the ratchet and then pushing, left to loosen everything up. And then what we're gonna wanna do is just break these free. There we go. And then we'll move on to the next one. We're only gonna loosen them up just a little bit because we gotta take this crankshaft locking tool, we're gonna spin this clockwise, remember, all the way around and put it on the two that we just loosened so we can break the two free that the crankshaft locking tool is on. So holding on this side and pushing up, which is a loosening direction to loosen these up. All right, so now that that's broken free, we can take our crankshaft locking tool. We're just gonna spin this basically 180 degrees around, clockwise only, of course. So so that one's loose. We're on one of the loose ones. That's where one of the tight ones is. So I'm gonna come back around. I'm gonna get this positioned here. They're torqued in there pretty good. You may want to invest in a 1/2-inch set of E torques or ratchets, E sockets, rather than 3/8, just because it's going to give you a little bit of a longer handle. Longer handle gives you a little more torque, a little more leverage. All right, so this should be the last one that we got to break free. All right, so we're getting on that. There we go. All right, now they're all broken free. Should be able to loosen these up by, yep, they're all finger loose. So we'll just continue pulling these out. 1, 2, 3. Yeah, so if you're doing this solo, I'd strongly recommend, this is just a little bolt here, threads in to kind of brace that other breaker bar that was holding the crankshaft locking tool. Just frees up that other hand, so when you're on that ratchet, you're not just pushing this way and having it spin off. You can hold that extension in place and get the rotation. So now that these 4 are all out, we're going to grab our flange that's going to go in here. It's going to bolt in, and then our pulley that's going to drive our secondary alternator is going to go on top of that. So okay, so these are the crank pulley bolts that we just removed using the crankshaft locking tool. We're moving on to this step here, which we're going to be bolting this flange and the spacer, which will go in there, using these 4 bolts in the hardware kit that also includes these bolts, which are going to attach this pulley once we're all said and done. We're going to reuse our crankshaft locking tool. That's actually going to bolt onto here. That's going to allow us to hold this in place while we torque these down. Having this bolted to here should make torquing these quite a bit easier than it was to remove these, so looking forward to that. But next step, this is going to fit in there. This fits in to, you can kind of see the plus sign here inside, and you can see it from the video. This is going to slide into there. We're going to have these 4 bolts go through this large washer here, and then these are going to get torqued down in this sequence here. So moving on to that step, let's move over to the vehicle. All right, so we got our bolts out. You can see this is kind of teetering here, and this is why we relieve the tension of that belt. So we want to get this flange, and this is going to slip in just like that. We're then going to grab one of those bolts and that kind of 4-way washer. I'm going to pre-assemble it like so, and then get this started in here, because I don't want this crankshaft pulley coming off. I like for it to stay right where it is. We'll just get these 4 bolts started. All right, and since I'm not gonna go all the way torquing down just yet, I just wanna get this snug back up. We're going to tighten this down. In a cross pattern, so we're gonna get these snugged up. We don't need the crankshaft locking tool because we're not going to torque. Also, if the crankshaft moves right now, it's going to move in a clockwise direction, which is okay. So feel free to get these snugged up before you break out the crankshaft locking tool and the torque wrench. Okay, we finally hit snug on that one. We're going to go directly across from it. Snugged there. Next we'll go to this one. Snug. Last. Get this one snugged up. Now that we got this mostly snugged, we're going to grab out our torque wrench, and each one is going to 37 foot-pounds. All right, so we're going to tackle this one first. And we're starting to spin though. We'll grab our crankshaft locking tool. All right, we've got our crankshaft locking tool bolted onto our flange here. So now we're just going to be targeting these bolts and tightening them down to 37 foot-pounds each. There's that one. And we want to make sure we go across. So feeling around because I can't really see. We've got this one. That one, we want to go to one that my thumb is on. Tighten that one down to 37 foot-pounds. Okay, and we'll go to the one next to that. And then last, we'll go to one across from that one. Okay, the next part, we tighten each one 45 degrees. about a 45-degree angle this way, and I'm going to take it down to horizontal. Okay. Now I need to go to the one across from it. Take that down to 90. And then we repeat that process 3 more times. All right, guys, we got our crank pulley installed here. Those bolts are all tight. So before we go too much further, we're actually just going to reinstall our drive belt on this tensioner here. And so we've got our T60 back out. Make sure we're looking good on the other pulleys. And we are. So we're good there. Now we're all good to start attaching the drive belt pulley for the secondary alternator. All right, guys, so we've got our auxiliary pulley here. We're going to be mounting it onto this flange using the included bolts. So I'm just going to get this lined up here, get one started. These are going to be tightened to 25 Newton meters, or I believe 18 foot-pounds. And we're going to do that same kind of crisscross pattern as we tighten this one down. All right, we've got our torque wrench set here. It's a 13mm socket. Torqued, I'm going to come across. You notice the crankshaft is moving, but the torque is low enough, and since we tighten that belt, the drive belt back up, it's holding it in place. You can easily kind of hold the crankshaft in place. So we'll go back through, we'll just make sure everything clicks off. There we go. All right, guys, so the next piece that goes on is this bracket. And this is actually bolting onto the side of the oil pan. You'll see there are actually machined surfaces with threaded holes into the oil pan. That's going to be installed with these bolts. And then after the fact, it shows the idler going on, and then this triangular lobe that's going to hold the alternator on the back side. And what we're actually going to do is pre-assemble this onto this bracket, just so you can see it before we mount it on to the oil pan, because it's going to be kind of hard to film that underneath. So we're going to start with this bracket here. You can see that there. We've got our hex flange that goes through. With this here, our idler pulley. Now you'll notice there are no grooves on that, so that's going to be this idler pulley here. It's going to go on here, and then we've got our cap and bolt. It's going to attach that to there. So pull this apart. We'll get this bolted on using this hardware here. Okay. All right, moving on to the back side. And considering these fasteners don't need to be tightened until later in the instructions, I would actually suggest, since we have access to all 4 of these bolts to tighten this to the oil pan, you also could install this ahead of time. Again, easy way to align this. I'm kind of doing it backwards. The instructions are upside down. This hole's slightly larger here, so these 3 holes are what's aligned to bolting it on there. And then same thing for this little bracket. You can see this hole's a little bit larger, so these holes are where the bolts go through, just to help you with alignment, the way this thing's keyed on there. So bolt number 7, as it says, do not tighten fasteners. Number 7 until instructed later in the manual. Looks like the same goes for number 7 here. So these are snugged on, just hand tight. And now we're going to install this through the back side of here. And we have this going on there. That has a torque spec of 25 Newton meters. There's also another pulley that we could install, which is going to go right on the front surface here. This one looks to be symmetrical, so kind of agnostic as to which way it goes, versus the other one, the metal back side plate, that's going to go towards the bracket. So this one can go either way. And this is going to get torqued to the same 25 Newton meters. There we go. Much easier showing that out here, trying to film that in the front of the engine. And lastly, we've got our tensioner, which we will wait to install that once we get it on the front there. It's going to be kind of clumsy dealing with our tensioner here on the front of this, but essentially it's going to go right in this general area. So now we can move this bracket over to the engine. We'll bolt this to the oil pan, following these steps right here. So that's going to be tightening down to 30 Newton meters or 22 foot-pounds. 4 locations here using these 4 bolts. Torqued. There we go. Bracket is installed. All right, guys, so the next step, we've got our bracket on, all of our idler pulleys are on. The next step is going to be to add this automatic tensioner. So we've got 2 bolts here and the spacer. The spacer is going to be going through on this side. We have, in the instructions, it says torque bolt 13 to 20.3 foot-pounds or 27.5 Newton meters. Unfortunately, there's not a bolt labeled 13, so maybe an error in the instructions, but there is a bolt labeled 15, and that is going to be 30 Newton meters. That's the socket head cap screw. So the hex head is what we're going to be torquing to 27.5 foot-pounds. So we'll get this all underneath. We'll bolt this up to the bracket, and then the next step is going to be putting on the alternator. So we're going to start with our socket head cap screw and get that started. We're going to leave it a little loose because we do have to add this spacer on the bottom. I want to leave some room for that. It's going to go right in here. All right, and remember, so this bottom one, this hex head, this is the one that's going to 27.5 Newton meters. The top socket head cap screw, we're going to be tightening that to 30 Newton meters. My torque wrench is already set up with a 13 millimeter socket, and it's set for 27.5 Newton meters, so we'll start with this bottom one. And clicking out, we'll change out our bit to a 6 millimeter hex head, and we'll move up to this top one. Get it threaded in by hand as much as we can here. Save us a little time with the ratchet. Okay, we'll reset this to 30 Newton meters. There we go. All right, now our tensioner is in place. We're gonna move on to mounting the alternator on the side of this bracket here. All right, guys, we got our automatic tensioner installed. We're moving on to installing the alternator. So we've got these 2 M10 bolts here and a series of spacers and washers. For the top bolt, we're going to be coming through. We've got the washer. We're going to have a thin spacer and then a large thick spacer. So it's actually going to be this bolt here. And then we do have a nut that's going to be on the back side of this lobe piece that we installed here. And this, if you remember earlier in the steps, it said don't torque these number 7 bolts down until later. This is where we're going to torque those down. So we've got this bolt set up. This is going to be our top bolt, and then our bottom bolt we have, coming through. Got the washer, and then this short spacer that's going to be on the front side, and then this is already a threaded insert in the bracket. That's going to go through the bottom lobe of the alternator. I'm going to start with this lower one because the top one has 2 additional spacers that we're going to have to kind of finagle in there. You may need to shimmy the alternator back and forth a little bit to get everything to line up. Grab this nut for the back side. Okay, now this is where we tighten down the number 7 bolts that were left loose earlier in the instructions to 30 Newton meters. And there's 2 more on the back side. We are working a bit blind here. These 2 M10 bolts, these are going to be tightened down to 50 Newton meters, and that's going to use an 8mm socket. So we'll readjust our torque wrench to 50. Next step is we're going to be cycling this automatic tensioner. There's a T55 Torx socket on the front of this. So we're going to grab the male socket, and basically what we're going to do is just cycle this back and forth until through its full range of motion 3 times, just to kind of break in this tensioner, make sure everything's working properly. 1, 2, 3. All right. We are now ready to install our belt on our alternator here. So that's going to be the 6-groove Gates belt, and we'll take a look at the routing. Should come around here, around this, into the inside here, up and around our pulley, back down, around this, and then back around our alternator. All right, we're getting our belt affixed here. We will need that T55 again in order to take the tension off so that we can have enough slack to guide this belt all the way around that pulley. So it seemed like the best way to actually route that was get it around the main crank pulley, get it around the alternator, have it resting through here and kind of leaving it off of this grooved pulley, having this grooved pulley be the last one that you put on. So that seemed to work the best, or was the easiest, where we found success. The other option you could do, maybe take this belt out ahead of time so it's not all wound up and kind of preformed in the case, to let it kind of relax a bit more so it's not kind of having a bunch of bends in it. But there we are, belt's on. Next thing we'll do, last step, we're going to put these dust covers. There's a dust cover for both of these idler pulleys, just a plastic cover that's going to snap on to cover up the bolts on these and cover the bearings. Our alternator is in, the belt is on, and the last step that we're going to be doing is putting that coolant tube back in and filling the overflow reservoir back up. So right now I'm actually going to pop this clip out so that it'll accept the tube. That'll hold that there. So you can see this clip here we just popped out, and this is where we're going to be installing the coolant tube in here, and then our hose is going to be on the other side. So okay, we got that part snapped in. This bolt should be about lined up. So you can see this is the bolt I'm working on right here. I'm just tightening that in by hand for right now. The coolant tube is connected, so I'm going to slide that silver pin, push that down. Definitely always want to tug on that tube to make sure that you've gotten the clip in the right place, because that was not actually clipped in. So now I've got to pull that out and retry that again. Because you can see it did not capture the tube, so I've got to push that in a little bit more. There we go. You can see how previously this was pushed into about flush. To me, that looked like that was good, but you'll notice when I wiggle it, see how it pushes in all the way here? Now when I snap that in, now when I try and tug that tube out, it doesn't come out. So when you're doing those coolant tubes and you snap it on, just make sure you give it a little tug to make sure it actually is captured and sealed. Because you don't necessarily want to start this up and then have the water pump kick on and just purge all of the coolant out of it. All right, we're gonna grab an E10 Torx. We're gonna tighten up that bolt here that's securing the other end of the coolant tube. All right, so here's our coolant tube. We're gonna be opening up that clip, positioning it down. Snapping it on and securing the clip there. And always give that a good tug. You can actually, I might have caught that, the pin actually dropped into place after I gave it a little tug. All right guys, we've got our alternator installed, all the bracketry, the belt is on. The only thing that's not done is the wiring, but we want to get this thing started up, make sure all the belts are aligned and everything. And part of that is re-topping up the coolant. So we have our bucket here. You can see we didn't actually lose a ton of coolant. We bought enough coolant to refill the entire system, so it's about 3 gallons. This is maybe half a gallon, not including what mistakenly spilled on the floor. But we're gonna top this up in the overflow reservoir, start the engine, let it cycle through, and then just continue topping it up until it is at the full level in the reservoir. Steady hands, steady hands. Check out the coolant bottle. All right guys, that wraps up our alternator bracket install on this 2-liter OM654 diesel for the Mercedes-Benz Sprinter. We've got the Technique bracket kit installed, our automatic tensioner has been cycled, the belt is on, the alternator is bolted in. It is not wired yet. If you're interested in taking a look at how we're going to wire that in, stay tuned for our ARCO alternator install and wiring video. In that video, we're gonna cover wiring in this A275L alternator, as well as the ARCO Zeus external regulator, and getting that programmed for our battery bank. Similarly, the install will also cover or be applicable for the 48 volt and 24 volt LTO alternators from ARCO. If you are installing a different alternator to use with this Technique bracket kit, I would follow the instructions from that alternator manufacturer. If you have any questions, please give us a call, 888-929-3149, or hit us up at customer care@RackUp+Go.com. And remember, life's an adventure, rack up and go.